Hello everybody! Today, I'm going to show you how I turned this thrifted men's shirt into a sundress. That's today on Refashioning with Rachel. First, I cut off the bottom of the shirt in a straight line. Then I grabbed a sleeveless dress that fit me well to use as a guide. I folded down the straps to about 1 inch past the neckline and lined up the curve of the armhole with the side seam of the shirt just under the sleeve and traced out that armhole curve onto the shirt. I connected those curves with a straight line and then cut out this shape. And set aside this piece for now. I took the sleeves that I cut off the shirt and cut off the cuffs and cut it open along the underarm seam. I made a couple of notches to indicate the middle of the sleeve and did the same thing with the other sleeve. I drew a line down the center of the sleeve and then 2 lines 5.5 inches away from that center line. Then I cut along those lines and ended up with 4 5.5 inch wide strips of fabric. I squared off the square ends of the strips and straightened out the other end of the strips with a diagonal line. Then, with right sides together, I pinned the strips end to end. Then I sewed all of these seams together, making one big loop of fabric. For the strips that I cut on an angle, I pinned them together slightly staggered so that the stitching line would end up right where the 2 strips meet. So then when I unfold it, the raw edges are in a straight line. I used a serger to finish my seams, but a zigzag stitch would have worked just as well. Then I made a basting stitch all around one side of the loop. Since I didn't want my dress to open up at the bottom, I stitched along the front button placket of the dress. I switched over to a zipper foot to do this, so that I wouldn't run into the buttons. I made a mark at the center back of the dress and made 4 evenly spaced marks on the ruffle. I didn't need to make 4 marks on the dress because it already had side seams and the front button placket. After I made all of my marks on the ruffle, I pulled on one of the basting stitch threads to gather up the ruffle until it was about the same size as the bottom of the dress. Then I pinned the ruffle to the dress with right sides together, matching up the marks I made to the front button placket and the side seams and the back of the dress. And then I sewed the ruffle to the dress. I worked with 1/4 section at a time, evening out the gathers as I sewed. Once the ruffle was attached, I pulled out the basting stitch threads. Then I top stitched the seam allowance toward the bottom of the dress and away from the ruffle so that the ruffle would lie a little more smoothly. Then I hemmed the ruffle simply by folding over the raw edge twice and securing with a stitch. I made these folds as narrow as I possibly could so that I wouldn't lose any length of the dress. Then I took the dress that I used as a pattern and folded down the shoulder straps and measured the length of the top of the dress, which happened to be 11.5 inches. Then, using some scraps of fabric from the shirt, I cut out 2 strips of fabric 11.5 inches long and 2 inches wide. And then on each of these strips, I folded down and ironed a 1/4 inch of fabric. I made a basting stitch on the top of both the front and the back of the dress. I realized this button would be in the way, so I removed it for now. I marked the center of one of the strips of fabric and pulled on one of the basting stitch threads and gathered up the top of the dress until it was about as wide as the strip. Then I pinned the non-folded edge of the strip to the wrong side of the dress, lining up the center with the button placket. Then I found and marked the center of the top of the back of the dress and gathered the fabric until it was as long as the strip. And pinned the non-folded right side of the strip to the wrong side of the dress. And then I sewed the top front of the dress to one strip of fabric and the top back of the dress to the other strip of fabric, evening out the gathers as I sewed. But I didn't make any gathers at the end and at the beginning of the strip. So right here at the end of the strip, there's no gathers in the top of the dress. Then I removed the basting stitch. And then I folded over the strip of fabric to the right side of the dress and made sure the folded edge was lying just past the stitching line and stitched it down, making the stitch very close to the folded edge. And I followed these same steps on the back of the dress. And then I decided to make a decorative wavy stitch all along the strip so that it would lie more flat and be even more secure. Then with the rest of my fabric scraps, I cut out a bunch of 1.5 inch wide strips of fabric until I had enough strips of fabric to make 2 50-inch long strips. I sewed these strips of fabric together end to end. And then ironed the seams open. I found the center of each of these strips and then pinned the center of the right side of the strip of fabric to the wrong side of the dress at the side seam. And then I kept pinning all around the armhole. And did the same thing on the other side. And then I sewed the strips of fabric to the armholes using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm sewing closer to the raw edges than I normally would, making sure that all of the raw edges are lined up. Then, working on the right side of the dress, I opened up the strip of fabric and folded back about 1/4 inch, and then folded that over the seam allowance, making sure the fold went just past the stitching line I just created, and pinned it in place. And then I kept moving down the strip, folding in each of the raw edges, and then folding them in half, and then pinning it in place. And I did the same thing on the other end of the strap. And then I sewed the whole strap, making a stitch very close to the double folded edge of the strap. When I got to the armhole, I made sure that the folded edge was just past the stitching line and continued sewing close to the folded edge. And of course, I repeated all of these steps on the other armhole of the dress. I finished off the ends of these straps simply by tying them in a knot and trimming off the ends. I made a tie for the dress by sewing together a bunch more 1.5 inch wide strips until I had a strip that was twice as long as my waist, and folded it in half long ways with right sides together, and made a stitch 1/2 inch away from the folded edge. I turned this long tube of fabric right side out, and finished off the ends with a knot and a snip. And lastly, I reattached that button that I removed earlier. And then this project was finished. So here's a reminder of how it looked before. And here's how it looks now. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you did. And check out some of my other refashioning videos. And have a beautiful day.